about relationships where maybe the husband or the wife is more dominant than the other.
You know, sometimes it's real easy to say it's going to be either my way or it'll be your way, but how do we find a nice mix of the two? And this is where the husband is receiving influence from the wife is able to speak and him consider what she's presenting.
So, you know, we're talking about maybe a man not receiving influence from his wife. We do see that a lot. We see a lot of relationships where she can't speak and be involved in anything decision making. We see it where women will do it as well, but we want to speak to both. So first, let's talk about where maybe the husband is not receiving influence from the wife.
Yeah, you know, first of all, a man has to be able to see that his wife has something valuable to offer. You know, so many times I think in our culture today you hear of the phrase cancel culture. If we don't like what we're hearing, we turn it off, or we boycott, or if we don't like what we're hearing. In the marriage, you're not always going to like what your spouse contributes. You're not always going to immediately see the value of that.
You know, we hear so much how the women are supposed to submit. And I think that's been ingrained into the minds of couples, and it kind of gets out of balance. It's almost as if the man or the woman is supposed to be held to a biblical standard, but the man isn't. And that's something we want to address. What is the man supposed to be doing? Because it makes it difficult for a woman to submit when a man isn't doing his part.
You know, you have to be able to seriously consider, you know, when a wife is presenting something and a husband doesn't immediately see the value of that, you don't just kick it out. Then you need to prayerfully or seriously consider what's being presented and look at it from a different angle. You know, I can't see what's behind me. I can't see the back of my head. I don't have eyes in the back of my head, and I need a different set of eyes to be able to see things that I don't see.
So, you know, what are some scenarios, where he isn't receiving from her? You know, he may not, because he's the head of the house, right? He may not seek out her input. He may not go to her and ask. And we would submit that the man is the head of the house when God said he needs a helper, and then he gave the wife as that gift of help, that there's a duty, there's a responsibility to seek out the help. And, you know, she may offer help, but the husband may silence her. He may get defensive or upset with her so that she feels that her help is not welcome and that she has to force it if it's going to be heard at all.
You know, sometimes that's all we see is how your viewpoint differs from mine, and that the two cannot blend. It's going to be either my way or your way.
Yeah.
And sometimes we just have to stop and look at it and seriously consider it long enough and to see how God, what he intended was, he said the two shall be one. He intended that two different perspectives can be combined together to come up with one different perspective that represents the marriage.
Right. You know, some other things that might be in the picture are, you know, a man might think, well, she doesn't have good opinions.
Mm-hmm.
I don't value what she says because I don't think they're good enough. He might be afraid of the yes dear mentality.
Goodness. And I want to speak into that. How many times have you heard maybe a man about to get married and a friend or a parent or something says, you know, hey son, you need to remember to, whenever things come up, that you say yes dear. And sometimes I think a man can look at, if his wife doesn't feel heard, doesn't feel like her influence is being received, that all she wants is to have it her way, and his response just needs to be yes dear, we'll do it your way. That's not the way God intended it to be, is you just say yes dear.
Right. Other things that might be in the picture, maybe he, and this can happen with the women too, they're only seeing their self.
Oh, yeah.
You can see the husband or the wife a lot of times weighing in the input of the spouse as if it were that of a child. And a lot of times you'll see this, maybe the man he's the head of his house, and she's basically just a child, or the woman who's overly spiritualized herself and sees herself as more spiritual than her husband, and he's basically like a son, and so they're not weighing in the perspectives as if they're partners, but they're looking more at their spouse as they would a child.
We need to validate each other's perspective that's different. One thing that got us started talking about this was we were thinking about the concubine mentality, where a woman is in a relationship with her husband, but she doesn't feel like she is a real a valuable contributor, and she just feels like maybe like a prostitute or a concubine because there is no valuation given for her input.
And a woman can feel like that if she's basically, just there for the bedroom, but there's no authority, right? There's no partnership. They don't share power. There's no balance. You look at who makes the decisions most of the time and what percentage included her input. And so a lot of women feel these ways. A lot of women feel pushed to the side. And like we said, there's those marriages where the woman is doing it to the husband as well. So we want to submit to you some thoughts about how we should look more positively at the contribution of our spouse.
And another thing is that a woman can feel dominated, like she is just a doormat.
Yeah.
And we're just bringing up these typical things that we hear that people, why they're pushing back to becoming one.
Yeah, basically is a shallow relationship. There's just one dimension, and it's he or she. But basically, there's the feminine part of God and the masculine part of God, and God did not create the masculine part to dominate the feminine part, nor the feminine part to dominate the masculine part. But they were meant to be equal, as God would make one out of two.
He said not to be unequally yoked. And so the thinking there is that he intended for us to be equal in this. He talks in 1 Peter 3:7, where he says that the husband is to look at his wife as being that they are heirs together, and that we're sharing in power. We're sharing and able to receive influence from each other.
Yeah, and you look at that, unequally yoked, meaning to yoke up differently, to associate discordantly. When you look at yokes of oxen, they say that if one is stronger than the other, or taller or shorter than the other, they'll go in circles. And, I think in the marriage, if you look at, if one dominates over the other, they're not getting anywhere. They're definitely leaving out a perspective that God intended to be brought into the picture in their decision making. And so we look at two being one, and there's a miracle in that. It's not a he or a she. And if you're looking at your marriage and you see predominantly he or predominantly she, there should be concern there, because it should be a good blend of both.
We have to ask ourselves some questions sometimes and see, why is it feels like things just go one of our ways and we're not seeing the two of us working together and able to blend.
And so we need to seek the input of the other person. We need to ask questions before we make decisions. Because you know what? You have to answer the question, whose household is this? Is it his? Is it hers? Because in a lot of marriages, she, for example, may feel like the finances are not hers. She has zero say. She has very little say.
She just gets what he doles out to her.
Like a child. Or you might look at the running of other parts, other components of the household, the raising of the children. Is she dominating? And he's basically just an observer. That's not good, and we should be concerned. So to what extent in your marriage is there a great blend? Are you seeing too much he or too much she? Because God didn't intend for two to become one, as in two to become he or two to become she. where one person would lay down who they are to become the other person.
You know, it's like a dance, I think, and that's
Yeah.
what I think stands out so much as being a romantic part of the marriage, is where you have a couple and they're both moving in synchronized with each other back and
Yeah.
forth. It's not just the man's over here dancing and the woman's watching, or vice versa. The two are moving together. They're synchronized in what we're
Yeah.
doing.
And it would be great to ask, do you feel sufficiently heard in this marriage? You know, do you feel like we're partners? You know, because if one person says, I don't feel heard, or I don't feel like we're partners, you need to reconsider, do you really have a marriage? Do you have a concubine situation where you've got a servant slave, you know, that's there to meet your needs and fulfill your desires, but they're absolutely not a partner at all?
I'm just using my spouse to meet my need, but I
Right.
don't really care about their influence in my life or in our
Right.
decision making.
You know, in 1 Corinthians 7, it talks about that we are supposed to be seeking to please our spouse. How is it pleasing our spouse if we're actually seeking to please ourselves, and the spouse is actually displeased because they feel disregarded and cast aside?
I love that, because he says that a married person cares for the things of the world, how he may please his spouse. So God
Yeah.
has given us that goal of how can I please my spouse.
And there's a difference between a single person and a married person.
Yeah.
A married person doesn't get that, where they can just be pleasing to themselves, make decisions on their own, and act like a single person and call themselves married. Because, you know, we find that a lot of couples say they're married, but they don't act married. They act like two single people living like roommates in the house. And so to be married means we believe we must be one, and that means when a decision is made, the two became one in that decision, and it resembles he and she, not just him without her, or not just her without him. It's not to say there won't be times where a decision might be made that, you know, maybe is what Sean wanted,
Yeah.
or what Rhonda wanted.
Right.
But there should be a good balance of
Right.
that. For the most part,
we should both understand why we're doing things the way we're doing it, and then
Right.
I'm not just laying down the way I think, you know, to do it your way, because I don't want to get into the battle over, you know, why we're doing it that way.
because God packaged certain things in the husband and other things in the wife. And those things are all important. And when we disregard part of what God put in that particular marriage, we basically dishonor the contribution of that spouse.
You know, the marriage relationship is the most powerful relationship that God put on earth. And he gave it, he said, as he said, it's a great mystery when he's talking about that husband and wife relationship. And I speak concerning Christ and the church. Yeah, our marriage relationship is to reflect our relationship with God.
Right.
And it is the most powerful one on earth.
And you know, when we think about like 1 Peter 3:7, for example, you know, the husband is told clearly, for example, to honor the wife because she is a vessel, an instrument, a gift from God to him through which God would work on him. And we look at the way she was created, why she was created, why the idea of marriage even happened, because God looked at the man and said, hey, he needs a helper, and he packaged her. So, you know, when a man doesn't go to his wife for that help, he dishonors the God who gave her to him for that purpose.
You know, that was such a transformational thing for me, is to go back and look in Genesis 2 where he said it's not good that man should be alone. I'm going to make somebody to help you. And really believing that God brought this person into my life to help me, and what they're presenting, I have to reinterpret it as help. This is help.
Yeah, you know, when we look at say the woman who is supposed to submit to her husband and what that means, you know, we don't say, well, that, you know, only if he's worthy of, you know, submitting. No, it's got to do with obedience to God. We don't look at the children and say, you know, you're supposed to obey your parents, but only if you think they're worthy. You know, you need to decide, are they somebody you should obey or not? the same is true when the husband seeks the help that is present from the wife. It's not a matter of is she worthy or not. It's a matter of knowing the God-given roles and allowing people to function in those roles.
You know, sometimes when we've been talking about something, Rhonda's maybe presenting her perspective about something, and you know, sometimes it's real easy if one of us isn't feeling heard, then they can kind of like a broken record keep repeating over and over because they don't feel heard. But then the other spouse feels like, okay, all you want me to do is just say yes, we'll do it your way. And then the one can say yes, well, okay, I'll do it your way, but then the other one isn't satisfied. I don't feel like that's what I'm after was for you to just say yes, do it my way.
Yeah.
We have to seriously consider what that input is, and sometimes I think we're not really practiced at the art excuse me, of being able to look at what someone that differs from us in the way they see something and seriously consider it. I don't see it your way, I see it my way, but I am going to value your input enough to seriously, prayerfully consider what you're saying.
And the thing is, we're trusting God. So when a man and a woman get married, a woman picks the man that she will submit to, that she can trust with her heart. And when we talk about submission, a woman being in subjection, we see in Ephesians 5 that basically she's gifted to him, and he's supposed to nourish and cherish her because of that. That's what being subjected to a man looks like, is a man that's there to nourish and cherish her. But then a man has chosen in his wife who he will for the rest of his life seek help from. Because that's why God created her and put the male and the female together.
I think it's a faith thing that we
have to
believe that God is speaking through my spouse. That doesn't mean that you don't ever ask questions, that you don't work through things.
Or you just follow blindly.
Right. It's not just, yes, dear, okay, we'll do it your way.
Or the same with the wife, yes, dear.
Right.
As in, there's no discernment or listening to God in it.
Right.
So another thing is, you know, we look at Christ, how he became man. And he was touched with the feelings of our infirmities so he could be a faithful and merciful high priest. And we see an example of Christ as in the Christ church relationship that we should model marriage after. And we see he walked in his bride's shoes so that he could be touched with the things that touch her, so that he could connect with her, basically.
You know, if a man doesn't see the value in what's being presented, that taking on that role of Christ who came and gave himself to become like a man so he could relate to what we are presenting. I mean, goodness, look, in Romans 8, he says that we are joint heirs with Christ. Who's coming out better on that end of the deal? But Jesus Christ, as God, is saying, I am being an equal heir together with you, my people.
Yeah, and we look at the Holy Spirit. You know, we look at Christ as being kind of that masculine part. And we look at the church, she is who she is because of Holy Spirit and her, that comforter, that helper that comes alongside. You know, and there's a lot of caution in there. Don't grieve the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
You know, and don't sin against the Holy Spirit.
Don't
because
quench the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, you look at that feminine aspect of God and you see God is very protective of the feminine side.
And we could just push right past all of that and not really pay attention to what God's saying. But to receive influence from God, we have to have our ears open. We have to be receptive to his influence.
Seeking it out.
Right. And so it works the same way in the marriage.
And so the husband-wife contribution can be looked at similarly to the church, right? We have the different parts of the body. We have the eye, we have the ear, we have the nose, we have the hands. And the eye can't look at the hand and say, well, I don't need you. You know, you're not like me. You don't think like me. You don't see things like I do.
You know, he said that the parts of the body that we think to be less honorable, he said, God has given more abundant honor to. And that's something that we can, you know, if you think, for example, that they, excuse me, your partner doesn't have a valid contribution on a certain topic that you're working through, then God has given more abundant honor, he said, to that part that lacked.
You know, and I think of as we look over all of this, I think the woman can submit to a man making a decision that might not be exactly what she thought, if she knows for a fact that he's going to prayerfully consider what she brings to the table, and he's going to be concerned if he did have to make a decision that they couldn't come into union on, and that he's going to take it seriously and take it before the Lord. And I believe a man finds it easier to hear the input of a woman when she's not insisting and demanding, but she's laying it on the table. You know, the women of the Bible, and certainly Holy Spirit is the helper, and having a lot of those feminine components of God is no doormat. You know, I don't think any of us look at the Holy Spirit and say, oh, what a wimp, what a doormat, you know, he's getting walked all over. But we see the Holy Spirit as part of God that is to empower, that we are to seek after. All of that to say, I think that when we're doing our role, we make it easier for the other person to stay in their role. Mm-hmm. But we have to validate what both bring to the table, not dismissing or minimizing of the other one because it didn't originate from me.
You know, I think that is such a challenge in today's culture, to be able to seriously consider a viewpoint that is not your own. And I think in the marriage, we need to make sure we're not letting the way the world responds creep into our marriage, and that we be able to seriously consider the viewpoint our spouse is presenting.
Because if we only needed one of us, we could have stayed single. Yeah. And then it could be he or she, right, with no obligation at all to blend and find union with someone of the opposite sex.
What's perfect is meant to be he plus she equals we.
And there's a miracle in that as God brings a union. And so as we look at the he and the she on the table, we say, how do these two come together? Mm-hmm. Not how they're clashing, there's no way these can work, it's either he or she. Yeah. No, we have to pray. If we don't see immediately how they come together, we should go pray. Lord, what is the blend of these two things? Because I don't want to discount either one. Right. I don't want to...
You want to validate.
Yeah, I don't want to belittle my spouse. I don't want either one of us to feel excluded from this marriage, because it's not a marriage of me. It's not a marriage of he. It's a marriage of we.
Right. Man.
Well, that was fun.
I know. This has been exciting. I think this is something that we all deal with in our marriage relationship, and learning how to become one.
So take away from this. Yeah. We would say, go pray about this. Ask your spouse, do you feel you're equally included in this marriage? Do you feel that it's the two of us that have become one, and not just one of us has become one and the other one has disappeared? Yeah. But do you feel that we are equally one in this relationship?
Yeah. And that's what he said. That's what he's talking about when he said about being equally yoked.